Hello, welcome to my new video, and in this video I'm going to show some games from Grand Prix in Berlin, specifically the semifinals of this leg 3. First I'm gonna start with the match between Wesley and Amin Tabatabaei. And in the first match, in the first game, Wesley was white. We had something that started as an IMSO structure, as an IMSO opening, but after knight c3, Tabatabaei chose to play d5 and said, just kidding, I'm going to go for Queen's Gambit. Wesley took on d5, went for the exchange variation, which is known to be very solid and offers slight edge to white. c6, and now black's idea is to go bishop f5 at some point and get this bishop out, which is usually the biggest issue of black. And here there are a couple of ideas. First one, which was played in the game, was to play queen c2 to stop bishop f5. The second one is to go e3 to just finish development, but this move allows bishop f5, and white can somehow challenge black by playing a move either queen b3 to target b7, but I think after this queen b6, black is fine by allowing this, because in that case black has a bishop pair and it's not so tough to... He has some compensation, of course. And but the second move he can play here is to go queen f3. After e3, bishop f5, queen f3 to attack the bishop. And when the bishop goes to g6, then you can take, but after queen takes and this queen trade, again, black has a ruined pawn structure, but the bishop pair makes up for it. And actually, Tabatabaei played a couple of games, I think 5 or 6, which I could find in the database, and he's handling these positions pretty well, so Wesley didn't feel like in the mood to challenge Tabatabaei in such positions, because even though the structure is bad, you cannot challenge that easily these pawns on the king's side. So Wesley chose in this position not to go for e3, but first to go queen c2, stopping bishop f5 from happening. And now black plays h6, bishop h4, and now bishop e6. The second best thing to bishop f5 tries to continue developing by knight bd7 and trying to somehow get his king to safety, of course. Now Wesley plays e3 and knight d7. Like I said, black just wants to finish development and castle. And here Wesley plays a really interesting move. I would not say so extravagant, but somewhat rarely played. He plays f3. And this move might seem very weird because it doesn't do anything to improve the development, but actually it does something, and that something is preserving the bishop pair. If you just develop at this moment, if you play just bishop d3 and try to get knight e2 or knight f3, then Wesley was probably afraid of this, and after bishop g3, knight h5, losing the bishop pair. And because of that, he wants to make some space for the bishop in case g5 happens, to have bishop f2. And the second point of this move is to prepare e4 push at some point. Not immediately, because the king is still not out of the woods, but in some time in the future to play e4 or even g4 if he decides to castle queenside. And black castles on the king side, of course. And here already we have only one game which was played in the past, and it was played between Lupulescu and Friedman from a couple of years ago, and here black played c5, trying to challenge the center, use the fact that the king is still not in the safe zone, and after bishop d3, black took, and went bishop d6, and eventually the game was drawn, and I think the position is quite okay for black. But here, after bishop d6, we had an entirely different position on the board. This was novelty. Wesley continued with bishop d3, and now c5, which was somewhat different than this game. But now Wesley plays knight e2. He plays this and tries to recapture on d4 if a move like cd happens. And now Tabatabaei plays c4, bishop f5. And now the play is somewhat divided. Black wants to play on the queen side and to stop somehow this pawn push in the center, while black wants to push on the queen side and white wants to stop it somehow, or to slow it down at least. And now Tabatabaei castles, because if he takes an f5, that just makes d5 much weaker, and he just chose to castle, even for a price of weakening this e6 pawn. Actually, in this case, d5 is under less pressure. So first, Wesley castles, queen e8, and now Wesley takes on f5, because black wanted to capture on f5 and then capture on e3. So he took on e6, and now Tabatabaei had two options. I think even queen e6 was good for him, going for rook f8 next, and then maybe some potential pawn push on the queen side by rook b8, b5, and trying to expand on the queen side. But for some reason he chose to capture with f-pawn, and now there is certain exchange of weaknesses. Now d5 is not a weakness, but e6 is. And it's not pretty sure what's better. Do you want to keep d5 as a weakness, or do you want to make e6? It feels like e6 is a better weakness to have, because it's less approachable for white. And now Wesley doesn't do anything in the center just yet. First he plays a4, prophylaxis. I think that his ultimate goal is to make this pawn majority useless, to somehow stop these two pawns by his only one pawn, and after that happens, to focus on the central activities. Tabatabaei plays a6, trying to somehow get his b5 in, but now Wesley plays b3. He tries to break this pawn chain, and also to open up the queen side, because he wants to stop b5 at any cost. Because in that case black has pretty decent game, and he wants to do it very early on to stop b5 from happening, and he does that. For example, if black takes on b3 now, then queen takes, and it's very tough for black to push b5 at this moment. And actually, this is the dream position, like I said. This is the dream position for Wesley, because with only one pawn, he's holding his opponent's 2 pawns on the queen side, and he can just, after doing that, he can just start pushing in the center and using his majority in the center, which cannot be stopped that easily. That's why black tries to make some piece play on the queen side by rook c8, and tries to anticipate bc4 by rook c4 and making some threats on that side against the knight on c3. Probably something like bishop b4 and doubling on the c-file and such things. And that's why white keeps tension on the board, and he plays rook a b1, trying to indirectly hit the b7 pawn. That's why Amin plays bishop b4, trying to block the b-file somehow, and also put pressure on the knight on c3, and that's why the bishop comes to e1. He tries to overprotect the knight on c3, and now knight b6. Also, we have one more candidate for the c4 square. This is the knight from b6, and now it was maybe the moment to capture on c4, because you cannot capture it immediately with the knight. You would have to go with rook c4 and now queen b3 to go. And eventually to exchange the bishops by knight a2. I think this was the way to go, but even queen a2 was okay, preparing a5 to kick this knight from b6. And this was the last moment for the knight to get more active, because a5 is quite annoying as a threat. And this was the moment to play bishop c3, and after this to take and go knight c4 next. Because let's say if you take with the queen, knight c4 is coming, and now you target the e3 pawn. You cannot defend it by bishop because there's a triple fork, which is quite insane. If you go back to d1, then there's time for a move like rook f7, and then just maybe even doubling on the c-file, pushing e5 at some point, and having a fully balanced position. So yeah, that was possible, but black played first rook f7, trying to secure the b7 pawn. And Wesley took on c4, rook c4, and now it's time for a5, like I said, to kick this knight from b6 to make room for attack on b7. And now black could have gone with knight c8, and after knight d1 offering the trade and trying to free the b-file, then to go bishop d6, and this would offer some counter chances maybe in the center by pushing e5 and opening up some avenues towards e3 pawn. But here Tabatabaei took on c3. He went for knight recapture, of course, and now again knight c8 was better because it keeps the defender of b7 alive. It can go to d6 and defend like that. But also maybe he was afraid of knight a4, knight c5 maneuver, but I don't find it as terrifying, because black might have e5 in the future and again put pressure on e3 pawn. So by going knight a4, he's exchanging the potential defender of b7, and after this queen exchange is not very good at this moment, because after this rook f2, the rook comes to b2, and the b7 pawn becomes a very fragile object. So rook takes on a4, but problems do not disappear. problems are still there, and the b7 pawn is the biggest problem in this moment. Now black tries with rook c7, although maybe it was better to just go rook a3 to put some pressure on e3, to somehow slow down this process of attacking the b7 pawn, but already the position doesn't feel really good. And he went for rook c7, which is very logical, trying to control the c-file, but after bishop g3, now either you go back with the rook, or you give up, go back to the 7th rank, defending the pawn, or you give up the pawn on b7, but going back on d7 is not so principled, and it means that you admit the mistake you made, and Amin plays rook c6, doesn't admit he made a mistake, and now it's time to collect the pawn, and this was the hope that Tabatabaei had, to somehow create counterplay by means of rook c2, rook a2, and to put pressure on the 2nd rank. But now Wesley just cuts that immediately by rook c7. Now rook takes, bishop takes, and now white is a pawn up, without any visible counterplay for black. He tries rook c4 with the idea of, let's say, if bishop e5, rook c2, and losing the queen. But of course, Wesley knows better than that. He plays rook c1 here, offering one more trade. And now if the rook goes back to a4, it just makes the rook very passive. There's no connection between the queen and the rook. They're completely cut off, independent from each other. So Tabatabaei just goes back to e8, trying to somehow connect the queen with the potential passer on the c-file, if this happens, let's say, to have queen b5 and to somehow get the game going. But first Wesley goes for bishop g3, tries to support the a5 pawn from the e1 square, and also to help the queen to deal with the c-passed pawn, which might happen. Now Amin plays queen b5, and now it's time for the exchange. And this was what black was hoping for, to have the c-pawn and as a passed pawn, and to create some mess in the position. And now a very nice move by Wesley. He plays e4. He limits the knight on f6 and doesn't allow knight d5 stuff with e3. And now it's tougher for black to include his piece, because with the queen alone, it cannot do much. Because bishop e1 comes next and the c-pawn is pretty much stopped. He tries this, but now bishop e1, stopping c3. And now black makes the final mistake. I would say already it's a tough position, let me tell you that, but I think with this move he just makes it much tougher for himself. The move he played was knight e8. He wants to make his knight more useful, but he makes the situation much worse. At the moment, knight on f6 doesn't do anything, completely anything. And he wants to make it, he wants to maneuver the knight from f6 to some better square, but probably it was better just to keep some tension by queen b1, and I think that white could probably make some progress by pushing the h pawn, the g pawn, and slowly gain some space on the king side. But yeah, he played just knight e8 here, which allows Wesley to play d5. And now the queen comes into play. king h7, queen f5, king g8 back, queen d5. Now they repeat a couple of times because it's around the move 40, so it's always useful to repeat several times. Not 3 times, but a few times. We have this, queen e6, and now king f8 has to be played, after which Wesley plays a typical expansion move, plus making some luft for the king by h4, and now queen d1 by Amin, king f2 defending the bishop, and now queen d4 check. For example, if black plays c3 with the idea of forking the bishop and the king, and now white can be very chill about it and play queen c4, double attacking the pawn on c3, and the point is after c2 to go bishop b4. And now you see the king doesn't have any good square. Knight e6 is the only move, and you can take, and eventually take this pawn on c2, and being 2 pawns up, I think there's no problem with this conversion. So that's why Amin played queen d4, and after king g3, c3 was played, and now bishop went to f2, after which Tabatabaei resigned. You may ask why did he resign? It might be too soon. Well, he resigned because of the king's position, not because of the material deficit or anything like that. The c-pawn is still there, and with the king being safer, let's say on h8 and the knight on f6, this could still be a really interesting game, but with the king being on f8, there's always this lingering threat of bishop c5 with some checkmate. So now black has very limited options. He can go to d6, after which you exchange and go bishop and go bishop c5, just targeting the knight. And this means that black is losing the knight. King e7, you have e5, and the c-pawn is very slow, because after this you have bishop a3 and you stop the pawn on c2, and additionally you have extra pawn on the king side, so that's just hopeless. The next option for black was to go queen b4 to stop bishop c5. So basically you want to stop bishop c5, and you can only do it by either queen d6 or queen b4. And after queen b4, now white has a nice queen d5 move, preparing bishop c5. And what do you do now as black? Again, queen d6 leads to the same variation, just a couple of moves later. If you give a check, then f4 happens with bishop c5 next. So there's no hope. There's no hope for black. And since there's no other move to stop bishop c5, there's no options, only queen d6 or queen b4, but you saw what happened in both cases. So that's what happened in the first game, and now Tabatabaei has to win on demand. And it's gonna be really tough. Let's see what happens in the match 2. In the second game, well, let me just put that. Let's just see if it works. Yeah, it works. Okay. Yeah, like I said, in the second game of this match, Tabatabaei has to win with white, which is very, very tough against Wesley, who is known to be a very, very solid player. And he chose d4 as the first move. And now Wesley plays very solid. He goes for the Nimzo Indian after bishop b4, knight f3, and we have the early a3, which is proved to be really, really dangerous weapon against the Nimzo, because recently in Tata Steel, let's say, we had several wins from white side. We had Jordan Van Forest against Giri. I think in the last round, Prague beat Yesipenko, and other games as well. And after capturing on c3, now we have a disbalance in the position. We have double pawns on the queen side for black, but he has a bishop pair, which can prove to be very, very dangerous for black's king. And if black somehow manages to tame the bishop pair or to exchange the light square bishop, then these statical components become more obvious and more relevant in the position. By static components, I mean this pawn structure which is shattered on the queen side. But white will not play statically. He's going to play dynamically, trying to have the initiative to gain more space and so on. And let's see what happens in this game. Black plays c5, and now he goes for g3, trying to employ his bishop to g2 and to make this bishop on c8 more miserable. So that's the time for black to play b6, bishop g2, bishop b7, and a very typical idea in the Queen's Indian structures in this opening is d5. And now the point is, after a move like ed, to go knight h4. And then to use this pin on the long diagonal to recapture then with the pawn and to get the, I would say, really good position, because white will have in that position a full center and take on d5 with the c pawn, castle, go e4, f4, and have a really dangerous central push. So Wesley doesn't take the bait, and he plays d6. Now Tabatabaei castles, and now queen e7 by Wesley. He tries to support his e-pawn and also prepares maybe... I think he tries to play prophylactically here to stop the e-pawn from progressing. And what happens now? Now Tabatabaei plays knight h4. And now I realize what he did by queen e7. So now he wanted to take on d5, because now the bishop is defended by the queen. And this was the signal for Amin to defend this pawn third time, because if you do something like rook e1, then he takes on d5, and this move doesn't make much sense, because you can take on c4 and the bishop is protected. But what could be played in this position was e4. A really interesting move here. e4, supporting the pawn, but you might think, okay, man, but the e4 pawn just hangs. What happens then? Well, in that case, rook e1 can happen, and if the knight goes back to f6, you have knight h4 with knight f5 next, bishop g5, and the bishop pair will eventually tell, because this pin on g5 can become really, really unpleasant. Plus, the pin on the e-file is very unpleasant. This pin is also, this pin is quite dangerous because of the e6 pawn. And if you try to remove yourself, well, then you can play bishop g5, and in case of this, to capture on e6 at least. So, if here you try to push f5, then again knight h4 comes. And if you take on d5, take the knight on e4 by pushing f3, but still, there is some compensation maybe for this lost piece. After this, knight f3. I think this position is still very complex because black has a full center of pawns. White feels a bit suffocated in this position, but I think white should be slightly better here. So in general, e4 should be a really interesting option. And if black refuses to accept the bait, then to just continue by rook e1, knight h4, f4, and start pushing for e4 next. But Tabatabaei chose a different option, just playing safely to, not safely, but very reasonably defending the pawn on d5. And now Wesley plays knight bd7. And now Tabatabaei plays rook e1. Prepares much better the move e4, even though it's possible to play it right away, but maybe he was afraid of some bishop a6, although it's not possible because of queen a4, but yeah, it's always good to step away from the pin and also to put the rook on the semi-open file, why not? And this was the moment for Wesley to target the weakness on c4 by knight e5. And now if you do some slow moves like queen b3 to just pose this threat, with bishop a6 it becomes impossible to defend. So Tabatabaei just chose to let this pawn go and plays e4. And all his hopes now are connected to some kingside initiative. Followed with bishop g5, f4, and trying to challenge black in the center. Now Wesley, of course, being a principled player, takes on c4, bishop f1, and now he goes back. And now his plan is to exchange the knights by knight g6. The knight on h4 can become a bit unpleasant, and it is the reason why black is so much why is black delaying the d5, capturing on d5, because knight f5 can become quite annoying. And now c4. Also, just to mention here, I forgot to mention that on b5 there is rook b1. For example, if black wants to keep his knight on c4 and pretend like everything is cool, rook b1 can happen, and if you take it, bishop g5 can become really tricky. Because, let's say if you take on e4 like that, then there's a nice sequence of moves, beginning with bishop c4, after capturing bishop f6. And now, because the queen is defending the bishop on b7, black has to capture on f6 if he doesn't want to lose the bishop, but now there is this move. And it appears to be that black loses the queen, because queen g4 comes next, followed with queen g7. So that's one possible course of actions, but of course none of that is forced. After bishop g5 you don't have to capture on e4, you can just do something else. I don't know what, but something else for sure. The e4 just loses the piece straight up. So yeah, Wesley goes here, c4 by Amin, trying to defend the d5 pawn to make the center much more solid. And now, if you compare the position with the pawn on c3, now there is additional option of bishop going to b2. And it's questionable if the pawn loss is such a tragedy for white in this case. Wesley plays knight g6, and now to avoid any trades, he goes back to g2. The reasoning behind this is just to keep the pieces on the board, because black is lacking some space, and with exchanges it would just help him to regroup. And now it's a really interesting moment where Wesley plays b5. He says, I'm not comfortable with the extra pawn, and I'm just going to break your pawns in the center by deflecting the c4 pawn to capture on b5. He's trying to make d5 much weaker than it is right now. And Amin takes on b5. Now we have taking on d5 and queen d7. Now both now d5 is under lots of pressure. That's why Amin plays knight e3, and now rook fe8. Now black is trying to capture on d5 with the small tactical trick, and Amin plays bishop b2, trying to put some pressure on the long diagonal, but I think the better try was to play rook e2 to defend this pawn. Because now capturing on d5 is not possible, because if rook takes, bishop takes, and now you're just a piece down. And also this move doesn't lose the b5 pawn, because after queen takes b5 there is rook b2. And now you attack the bishop, so queen has to go back to d7, but then there is bishop b5. Unluckily. So after this, bishop b2 was played, and this allowed Wesley to capture on d5. Amin took. And now first rook e1. A nice Zwischenschach. And now queen e1. Wesley took. And now there is also some potential danger on the long diagonal, because if queen and bishop form the battery somehow, the king can just be in so much danger. But at the moment it's not realistic. It's not very likely that this can happen. And Amin just uses this to attack the bishop. And this was the moment. This was the moment when things turned around. After this move, black chose this moment to use small tactics. And he played knight h4. Which seems very clever, because after gh, this is very terrible for white. Queen g4 check, and white gets checkmated. If you take on d5, knight f3 is also terrible, losing the queen. But what did Wesley so missed? This was the horrible mistake. Also, first, let me show you what was the better choice. The better move was to move the bishop to e6. And then to continue the game normally, rook c8, and so on and so on. Pushing the c-pawn maybe, and having a pretty normal game. Also, a bad move was bishop b7, but not as bad as the move in the game, because after bishop b7 the queen is not defended anymore, and white has the option of going queen c3, targeting the g7 pawn, and now f6 has to be played. And then now you capture on c5 and white is a pawn up. But in the game, knight h4 was played with this threat, and it looks very, very dangerous for white. But he missed one thing, and there's only one move that saves white's position, and not only saves it, but also wins the game, makes the game winning. And the move is rook d3, defending against knight f3, and also keeping both threats alive, capturing on h4, because now if you take on h4, queen g4 is met by rook g3, covering everything. And now you might ask, okay, but why do you stop? You don't stop knight f3, it's possible anyways, but now you capture, and black is an exchange up, of course, but temporarily. Queen c3. Queen c3, and now you attack the bishop and attack the pawn on g7. What do? You can do f6, but you lose the bishop. If you go queen g4, well, in that case you have bishop h3 or h3 just. And now the queen has to say goodbye to the bishop, because it has to cover g7, and it cannot do it anymore. And if you go queen d4, then queen f3. And now the rook on a8 is deciding the game, because you cannot capture the bishop. So Wesley has to find a different way to deal with this threat. He goes queen g4. For now, he's covering the threat of gh and rook takes d5, because still there is knight f3 as a threat. But now, unluckily for him, Tabatabaei still has queen c3 as a threat, and now bishop on d5 is under attack. And what should he do? If he goes to e6, well, now there is deflection, bishop e2. After queen g6, bishop h5, continue deflecting the piece. And finally, if you keep doing this, if you keep defending against queen g7, now as the final blow, f4, cutting out the last square from the queen. And if you go here, then just take on h4 and be a piece up. So what to do here? Black went for bishop e4. But now again, the same deflection tool, bishop e2. Queen has to go back to g5. And now white took on d6. Although it's possible also to go f4 like straight up. And after this, to go bishop h5. And after this, to capture and take on d6, and also you're losing f6 and the whole position just collapses. But Amin played rook d6, which was also quite nice. Now Wesley has to move the knight, because if he doesn't, then white plays f4. If he plays, let's say, h6, f4 comes, and the queen cannot defend against checkmate anymore. It has to give itself up, and it's not possible to maintain this position. So he chose to play knight f5, but now Amin plays queen e5, a very nice move, pinning the queen. And now Wesley chose to play queen e7, but this leads to a hopeless endgame because after... And that's what happened actually. Queen e7, knight e7, and Amin played a4, after which Wesley so resigned. I think it's premature, to be honest. I think you have to put more fight in this position, even though it looks completely hopeless because, first of all, White has a bishop pair. Second of all his pieces are quite nicely placed. Bishop is going to come to c4. There is a potential A passed pawn on the potential B passed pawn on the queen side, but you don't resign such positions, and I think it's just way too early to resign this position. Of course, with the precise play, you should lose this as black, but you don't resign this position. Okay, so that was the match number 1 between the winners of Group C and Group D. And we'll see the tiebreaks today. And let me go to the match number 2 between Hikaru Nakamura and Shakhriyar Mamedyarov. Mamedyarov was playing the tiebreaks the day before the day before game 1 against Vincent Keimer, and Nakamura just went through after beating his 3 opponents in a row. After beating Aronian in round 4, after beating Oparin in round 5, and Yesipenko in the round 6. And let's see what happened in these 2 games. Let me check. Yeah, this is working out. Okay, in the first game we had a very interesting choice by Mamedyarov firstly. He opted for the Petrov, which is quite strange because we know Mamedyarov as a very uncompromising fighting chess player, and Petrov really isn't any of that. It's just a very solid, very peaceful opening for black. But on the other hand, you can understand him because he was going through a very tough match against Keimer the day before, and maybe he was trying just to get through this first game and to make a peaceful draw. While Hikaru was resting, had a rest day, of course, and had more energy, and maybe this was the way to neutralize white pieces in the first match. Now Hikaru took d6, knight f3, and we have a very usual position from the Petrov. And now the second surprise of this game, queen e2. Queen e2 is not something that you do when you want to fight, and maybe both players were not in the mood to play fighting chess, which is what queen e2 also proves. And now queen e7, because you can't play anything else. If you play d5, d3 just loses the piece. So you have to play queen e7 and make peace with the fact that you might exchange queens on the next couple of moves. Now Hikaru plays d3, knight f6, and now instead of exchanging queens immediately, Hikaru plays bishop g5. Having a very strong positional threat of bishop captures f6. And Mamedyarov plays queen e2, exchanging queens. Although here it's also possible to delay the exchange by knight bd7. And after knight c3, there is a small trick here. It's nothing like white wins or anything like that, but if black tries to stop knight b5 by c6, then knight e4 can become really, really annoying for black, because now knight d6 is a threat. And black probably has to double his pawns at this moment. So actually here black has to capture and only then to play c6, covering all the jumping squares for the knight. But Mamedyarov plays this one move early, and after this bishop e7 was played, castle, and now we have h6. And now we have a question: where does the bishop go? And Nakamura answered with bishop d2. But the reasoning for this is maybe he didn't want to go to h4 because of g5, and eventually the bishop will become a very passive piece. And black might continue with knight c6, bishop e6, castling, and maybe even having some initiative on the king side. Let's say if you go bishop e6, castle, some rook dg8, h5, h4, something like that. Even though it looks a bit far-fetched, but there is a small chance of that. So Hikaru chose to play bishop d2, and now c5, seizing some space in the center. The same goes for white. He goes c4, and now they both have some weaknesses in their camps. They have some holes in the position, d4 and d5 for white and black, knight c6, knight c3, and now black castles as well. And we have something very, very interesting here, very symmetrical position, and that's where all the interest stops. It's only interesting because it's symmetrical when you see it visually, but to play a position like this it's not so interesting. And now the optimal plan for both sides should be to somehow eliminate their weaknesses on d3 and d6. And the way to go is to go, well, from black side to go bishop e6 and to push d5. And from white side, of course, to do the same but reversed, bishop e3 and d4. But Hikaru chose a different approach. He played rook fe1, which I don't really understand. It doesn't do anything regarding the d4 push, but it cannot be that bad. I think here the best was to go rook fd1 and then bishop e3 with d4, trying to eliminate the only weakness in the position. But he chose this, and now Mamedyarov plays bishop e6, trying to go for this plan of d5 and eliminating the weakness on d6. But now we see the real reason why he did rook fe1. After this move, we'll see the real purpose of this move. Hikaru plays bishop d1, tries to go to a4 and to ruin the pawn structure of black. Mamedyarov plays d5 anyways, and now bishop a4. It's not possible to capture twice on c4 because the bishop on e7 is vulnerable. In case of this, bishop c6 and you lose the bishop. So it's not possible to do that just yet. And also now there is a real threat of capturing on d5 because again, the bishop on e7 is quite vulnerable. So to over defend the pawn on d5, Mamedyarov plays rook fd8. Also, let me show you this. If black tries to hit the d3 pawn, this is bad because now white can just play a3, which is quite cool. And if black goes to capture, then cd. And again, the bishop on e7 is deciding the whole situation, because if black takes, just rook takes, and either you give up the bishop on e6 or bishop on e7. And with two pieces for a rook, black should be much better. So that's why Mamedyarov plays rook fd8, trying to protect d5, but this allows white to ruin the pawn structure by capturing on c6. But first white takes on d5, knight d5, takes, and only now he takes on c6. Only now, bc, and now knight e5. Okay, now white has a weak pawn on d3. Black has double pawns on the c file, so it's kind of counterbalanced, if it's a word. And now Mamedyarov plays bishop f6. Also was interesting to play c4. And to somehow keep this bishop pair advantage. If knight c6, to go bishop f6, and to somehow prolong this game to avoid simplifications. But I think eventually you would have to simplify. Let's say if you go d4, now black cannot capture on d4 because it just makes it more simple for black. And if he tries to kick the knight away from c6, you can do this, but after a couple of more moves, we have something similar to the game. White makes some kind of fortress, and it's not easy to break through. So actually, this is a quite balanced game. And Mamedyarov plays bishop f6, bishop c3, and now it's time to simplify. He wants to capture on d3, and he does it by taking on e5, rook e5, and we have one more exchange. And in the end, black is going to capture on d3 because the a2 pawn is also weak. But it doesn't matter because these pawns are so useless and the bishop can always protect against these two pawns. So white plays f3, black took on d3, but white is just like, okay buddy, good for you. Bishop c3 now. They just went through motions, and after this move, king f7, it's just game over because there's no way for black to make anything out of his passed pawn on the queen side, and that's it. A very peaceful game. Game 1 was over, and it's time to go to the game 2. The game 2 was more interesting, just to tell you that. And let me check if it works. Yeah, it works. Okay, so in the game 2, Mamedyarov was white, and he chose d4, which he usually plays. Nakamura chose a very solid opening, which he very often plays, the Queen's Gambit, and after bishop f4, castles e3, he chose this very, very solid line, knight bd7. The downside of this move is that white is going to grab some space. And I think here also an option for black is to play c5. And it leads to some different type of position. But black chose to play this, and the issue with this move that I have is that it allows c5. And usually when white plays c5 in such position, black tries to somehow punish this. But in this case it's not so easy, because if you play b6 straight up, then you might run the risk of losing by c6. Or simply just going b4. I think even b4 is a valid point in this case. And if he tries to break like this, well, then you can go a3 and still keep the composure of your pawn chain. So black plays c6 first, preparing this b6 without any potential c6. And now it's time for white to get more space on the queen side, and also to keep composure, like I said. Oh no, oh no. b6 by black. And now Mamedyarov plays a slightly awkward move. He plays h4. I don't know for what reason. Exactly, I don't see any attack going on the king side, which is possible. Here, usually what people play is h3, trying to make this bishop some space to h2, in case knight h5 happens, which is why h4 is also good, but it's not very flexible. And actually this was played several times by Fabiano Caruana against Nakamura with black. And here black plays a5, a3 is played, and now bishop a6. Trying to exchange a bad bishop for a good bishop, potentially on f1. And now it's not possible to play b5, because then if you want to do this with the idea of knight b8 and then c7, black can just ignore this threat and go queen c8, using the pin on the knight on c3. So actually after bishop a6, white usually captures, and castles. And still this is slightly better for white due to space advantage, but black appears to be very solid in such structures. He has no visible weaknesses, and he'll put some pressure on the a file by queen a8 and such stuff. So it's a pretty solid game, pretty solid position for black, but I would say he's not playing for anything more than a draw. But Mamedyarov plays a very weird move, h4. And now Nakamura plays the same. a5 doesn't change much. a3 by Mamedyarov, because let me just show you a basic undermining principle here. If white takes on a5, now you don't capture back with the rook. You take on c5 first. because the a5 pawn cannot escape. And then actually you're a pawn up after all this. So yeah, just a small tip. Mamedyarov keeps the composure of his pawn chain, as I said a billion times. a3 was played, and now Nakamura can play a move like bishop a6 and keep it very, very usual. After this, rook a6. And maybe now go b5. And after this to go c6, and after queen c8 to go c7 and then capture on b5. Maybe this is the chance to make black cramped. And even though black is a pawn down, it seems somewhat unpleasant, because c7 pawn is quite annoying presence. Yeah, I said that. And Nakamura chose something different, knight g4. I thought at first that the point of this move was to push e5. But actually, after Mamedyarov played bishop e2, Nakamura played h5, trying to cement his knight on g4. But actually I think that here e5 was pretty good, trying to undermine this pawn chain. In case of this, to take on b4, take, and after exchanging to take on c5. And then you take with a knight. This could lead to a very interesting game as well. So, yeah. After bishop e2, Nakamura went for h5, which was not which was really surprising to me. And now Mamedyarov plays b5, trying to get something like cb and c6. The c pawn will become really dangerous. You cannot go to b8 because of c7. If you go to f6, well, then again c7 is quite strong. And if you go to e8, bishop takes, bishop d7 takes, and now a very nice move, queen a4, exchanging queens on the spot, making this c7 much stronger, because there's no pressure like that, like with the queen on d7. Because if you don't do anything, black goes rook c8, knight e8, you won't have such an easy time to defend the c7 pawn. But when you do this, and let's say black takes on a4, knight a4, you might have king e2 next, rook hc1, also pressure on b6 as well, and it's not the same. And still there is the pawn on c7. So actually here it's best not to do anything, just to defend the pawn on c6 by bishop b7. And that's what Nakamura does. Bishop b7, and now he's happy to exchange all these pawns on the queen side. Mamedyarov takes on b6, queen b6, and now he castles. It's also interesting here to use this somewhat unstable somewhat unstable knight on g4 by knight g5. And now if the knight moves to f6, let's say, then there is this quite unpleasant move, because now the b pawn is passed pawn and the bishop is very bad. I don't know what to do here as black. If I exchange the bishop on a6, then the b pawn becomes unleashed, and I don't really prefer this for black. But luckily for black, in this position he can just take on b5, and if knight takes, let's say bishop a6, now the issue is if rook b1 happens, bishop b4 simplifies a lot. After this, bishop b5, and black exchanged a lot of pieces. And also there's the danger of creating a passed pawn on the a file by a4 just, and keeping the b pawn blocked. So actually this was not that dangerous. And now not king f1, white castles. Now Nakamura plays rook fc8, trying to connect his rooks in case of knight a4 to just go back to d8 and to keep his rooks connected. And here I think it was the moment for knight g5, because if you take, and now bishop a6, there is a4 at least, and you keep the queenside blocked. And I think the inclusion of h4, h5 is something that suits white at this moment. Because you can argue that white's kingside is also weakened as black's, but he has the bishop on f4, which covers nicely these squares. While this bishop belongs to f5, but it's not there. And white has some potential targets, like just making a battery on this diagonal, although black can organize pretty easily some defense. But I think it's slightly better for white in this case. But instead, Mamedyarov plays bc, bishop c6, because he wants to discourage knight a4 as a move. And now I think it was the moment to play a4, to make the room for the knight to jump to b5. Let's say if you do this, to jump here and to have a decent position. I would not say something special like in the previous case, but even the previous case is not something special, just something slightly more pleasant. But now, after bishop c6, white chose to play knight g5 now. And here it's time for black to play a4, to make the knight more uncomfortable, because it doesn't have any jumps. And in the case of some queen b3, it gets attacked. And it's not very pleasant at all. But actually, in this position, Hikaru chose to just go for knight f8. And now you cannot capture on g4, because after this, queen g4. The point is, after queen b2, you attack the knight on c3 and pawn on a3. And any try like queen h5 can be met by bishop e8. And I don't find really any challenge in this particular move, so it was time here again for a4 and then to jump to b5, but Mamedyarov doesn't do that. He chose bishop d3. Now bishop e8, targeting the knight. Rook b1 now, and after queen d8, he jumped to a4. Now he wants to get knight b6. So a3 pawn is not for free. And now Hikaru plays rook a7, trying to avoid this, and also preparing maybe doubling on the c file at some point. Mamedyarov plays queen b3, and now it's time to exchange the good bishop on f4. We have capture, knight f3, because you want to avoid checkmate, ideally, you know. Rook ac7, and now knight c5, which wasn't so good. The better try was queen b6. And now if queen a3, which seems very logical, to go knight c5, and the queen seems a bit off. It doesn't feel so comfortable, so black has to eliminate the knight by knight d7, and in case of this, let's say rook takes, rook b3, and now the a pawn is not so easy to maintain, let's say. Let's put it that way. If queen a2, you have rook b2. If you repeat just that's that, but if queen a4, then there's bishop a6. And in case of such move, then there is this. And if you go back to a2, then rook b1, rook a1 next, and eventually you'll lose the a5 pawn, I think. So, yeah. Mamedyarov plays this move, but now it allows knight d7, and the good knight is exchanged for a bad knight on f8. Takes, takes, and now a4. I think already here white is slightly worse, at best. Now black has some aspirations towards pressing, and he goes back to d1, and now I think this was the imprecision. After queen d1, Hikaru took on a4, and it forced some simplifications. I think it's best not to involve yourself in any simplifications like that. Just to go play something like g6 and slowly put pressure, keep the tension on the board. And when you compare these two pawns, the a5 pawn is much safer, because there's no intrusion like rook b5. The bishop cannot attack the pawn on a5, while the bishop from d7 can attack on a4. So long term speaking, it's much more pleasant for black. But he chose to do this, and after a few moves, we have a simplified position. Still, black has some upper hand because he has the c file and a better target, which can be f2. Plus, having this threat is always somewhat unpleasant, and g3 is not very pleasant to play, because let's say this was played in the game, so let me just show you what happens. Let's say g3 happens. Well, you have to look after knight e3 at any time. So after this, we had some moves, but Mamedyarov defended quite nicely here. He tried to exchange rooks. Nakamura at first decided to decline this offer, but after a couple of more moves, we had the exchange of queens. Knight h2 happened, and now Nakamura tried to play for a win, but we had a very drawish position. g3 now, rook ac3, and now we had the exchange of rooks. Rook c1, king f1, and now g5. This is a very typical motive in such endgames where one side, in this case black, uses other side's advanced pawn as a hook. Black's plan here is to create a passed pawn on the king side. And if he doesn't do anything, then black takes and h4 takes and makes the h4 pawn a target. So now Mamedyarov plays rook b8, king g7, check here, and now white did the right thing and he took on g5, hg, and now there is an unpleasant threat of creating a passed pawn, but I think if you go h4 straight away, you can take and go knight e3 with knight f4 and keep maybe even play for a win as white. So black chose to delay this by rook a1, and now this move. Trying to discourage black from playing h4 because, like I said before, after this, knight f4 comes, the h-pawn is stopped and it's not easy to support the pawn. While, on the other hand, e6 can become a huge target. So black doesn't want to allow that. After this, black gave a check, and now we had the exchange of rooks. And only now h4, because there's lack of resources that can attack the pawn on h4. Now we had this, and after king f3, they agreed to a draw. And the reason why they did that is, well, you can go king f5 now as black, and eventually you have one of two scenarios. The h-pawn gets used as a decoy. The h-pawn is a decoy, and black picks up lots of pawns on the other side, but black's knight also picks up e6 and is left against the d-pawn, which is enough to make a draw. The second scenario is, well, we have some status quo and nobody makes any progress. Neither white takes on h4, neither black takes neither black enters to capture the pawns. So let's just show one of those cases. If king g2 happens, you can go king g4 to protect the h4, but you can also go king e4. And in case of this, knight f5, knight a4, now the e6 is target. So if you do this, knight c5, knight g7 takes king f2, and now you eliminate the remaining pawn by e4, and it's just a simple draw after, let's say, even this. Knight e6, knight e6, and then this is a simple draw. Also, after king g2, if you go king g4, you can go f3 and make some fortress, you can say. And after king g5, you want to exchange as many pawns as possible by e4. After this, you go give a check. Again, knight c5 is a good resource to be used. And once you take e6, you're fine. You're just calmly going to collect the d-pawn as well, and that's it. Also, in this position, after king g2, if knight g4, then the same old. Knight e3, and now knight f4 or knight c5. Counter chance against the e6 pawn. And that's basically it. Again, we have the tiebreak, even in the second match of this semifinal, and we'll see what happens. Thank you so much for watching. If you got any questions about these games, let me know very soon, and I'm gonna answer